So what's at stake, especially its analysis starts after that brief, actually one chapter, the first chapter of the book has been devoted to that oppressive hypothesis, okay? And then he enters into the discussion of the sexuality to be able to show us how the production of modern sexuality plays an important role in the constitution of modern subjectivity. And actually, as you can imagine and guess easily, he starts with an observation. He says that especially only during the Victorian age, okay, where apparently sexuality began to be repressed during this time, we began to talk much about sexuality. The question of sexuality came to the foreground. This itself is an interesting observation, simply because this implies that prior to that Victorian age, okay, in the humanist perhaps, we don't know, there was not much talk about sexuality. I'm not sure about it, but and for instance, if we consider the sexual course or the pattern of sexual relations in ancient Greece or in England, for instance, as has been told by, what was his name? The author of Canterbury Tales. What was his name? Is there anybody who remembers the author of Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, okay? And for instance, another book, an interesting book, the author was, bana bir şeyler oldu, yazarların isimlerini unutuyorum. Tales from Decameron, Boccaccio, Cesare Boccaccio, and so on. Okay? There are certain such examples. The last two of which belonging to the medieval periods. Okay. On the one hand, we have another literature pertaining to the medieval periods, which is usually summarized under the generic title courtly law. Okay. So, yeah. Courtly law is taking place around the aristocratic circles, okay, representing that romantic, platonic kind of affection between a knight giving himself away as the servant to a lady. Best example, rather late, modernized, therefore caricaturized example of which can be found in case of the love felt by Don Quixote towards his Madonna. What was his name? Her name? Dulcinea del Toboso. Okay? So this was an imaginary character, as you know. When Don Quixote declares himself as knight, okay, when the time of knights was over, actually, okay, therefore it has been considered the first modern piece of literature. Okay, when the time of knights was over, Don Quixote declares himself to be the knight, and therefore to fulfill the function of the knight, he finds out or fantasies about that courtly love. Okay, a courtly love he feels towards that lady Dulcinea del Toboso, Dulcinea from Toboso. Okay, so it is this part of this story in the upper echelons among the nobility during the medieval times. On the other hand, however, among the rank and file, ordinary, poor folk, okay, especially the stories from Decameron and primarily those Canterbury Tales, okay, tells much about it, okay, and you'll find there that the common folk, if half of this story is told was true, okay, live in a promiscuously pervert world in terms of their sexuality, okay. That was strange simply because what you expect from common folk is a well-organized, ethical, moral life regulating the sexual conduct, etc. But the observation is itself interesting. an attribution of the development of modern sexualities to a certain time period, Victorian age, implying that in earlier age there had been not developed such sexual identities or sexualities. Okay? Actually, the Greek case, if we are going to use it as an example, which Foucault does, okay, shows us that there was no separation of the sexual identities in these times, okay? For instance, a man could easily get married with a woman by having a relationship with a boy at the same time, an affectionate relationship and sexual relationship with a boy at the same time. And it appears that it was quite common. At least we know that some regiments in Alexander's army, the Alexander the Great, that famous Alexander, have been composed of these homosexual couples with the belief that one fights better before one's couple, okay, one's lover, okay. So boys being lovers with each other had been put into the same regiment with the expectation that they were going to fight better than the ordinary regiments and so on, which itself shows that the establishment of sexual identities had not been a problem for the Greek people. Okay, one was homosexual or one was heterosexual was out of the question. Okay. Of course, this does not deal with the problem of gender. The gender was still there. Okay, they were describing themselves as separated from, as a folk separated into these male and female categories, men and women. Okay, so even though the concept of sexuality may come closer to the concept of gender, it appears that there is a huge difference between these two. Okay. Concept of sexuality rather aiming at the formation of sexual identities, okay, not gender, sexual identities. Okay, the argument is that while these disciplinary powers began to flourish on the one hand, as it has been told in the book Discipline and Punish, okay, on the other hand, roughly corresponding to this transformation, there appears to be an increasing, qualitatively increasing talk about the oppression of sexualities. But while we taken the oppression of sexualities as a new problem before us, actually what we are doing to produce lots of talk about what sexuality is, how it should be controlled, etc., etc., at the same time. It was this flourishment of the talk, or if you like, discourse on sexualities in connection with the newly developing technologies of power, which enables Foucault that modern sexualities began to be produced in this time period. Okay? And actually, as we can see, if you take a look at the literature of the period, the literature primarily deals with the problem of oppression of the sexual drives. Okay. Now, there's a problem here, however. If we try to locate this problem of oppression, this question of oppression, in connection with the arguments developed in the first chapter of the very same book, which was nothing else than the critique of the oppressive hypothesis, what kind of results you would expect to emanate from this rather strange connection? Okay, on the one hand, all the literature flourished during the Victorian age refers to the problem of the oppression of sexual drives. On the other hand, though, okay, the argument was against oppressive hypothesis. Power is not oppressive in the negative sense of the term. Power is what gives life, what makes you what you are, was the argument. Okay? What are you going to make out of this? I'm curious, that's why I'm asking. This is not a question of knowledge. Now I'm offering you, giving you two sentences which appear to be logically contradictory with each other, okay? So, and for instance, I'm asking you to resolve this contradiction by way of another third statement, so to speak. Okay? What kind of that statement could it be, I'm asking, okay?
Yani sexual drive'ı oppress ediyor ama sonuçta yeni bir form öneriyor. Yani bir kısmını oppress ederken, yani bir yönüyle oppress ederken diğer yönüyle de yeni birine hayat veriyor. Yani yeni bir yola, yeni bir veye, sexual veye.
Probable, possible. Actually, this is what really happens. When I think about it, this could be what really happens, simply because, okay, let's try to imagine the sexual life of the medieval society. On the one hand, we have the nobles. A medieval society is thought to be composed of at least 3 estates, okay, the addition of the 4th one giving the result of the necessary transformation of that medieval society, the bourgeois, 4th estate, okay. 3rd estate, nobility, clergy, and the serfs, okay. Now, we have seen that in case of nobility, what was at stake, the so-called, is it real? It's not real. But this is how the literature reflects the situation. So-called courtly law. Wow. Okay? Now, we know that this is the idealized picture of the real situation. Okay? The real situation is something like this. Okay? This is why the notion of courtly law has been introduced into the picture. The real situation was that the marital relationship was conceived to be a function of alliances. Okay? So one group of nobles giving bride to another group, therefore establishing an alliance system among themselves. Okay, and just like Levi-Strauss discussed the situation, okay, giving and taking wives. Okay, so establishing the alliances. Okay, therefore, marital relationship had nothing to do with the neither emotional nor sexual satisfaction. Okay? It was aimed at uniting the power and wealth of the respective families. Okay? Therefore, it was not an affair among the individuals, but it was an affair among the families, groups. Okay? Noble families here at stake. Therefore, they established those widespread networks of kinship relations. And when you pick up a noble family in Europe, for instance, you'll find out kings from very different countries, speaking different languages, but still being cousins with each other, etc. Okay? For instance, the Russian Tsar being the cousin of the German Empire, and so on. Okay? So, what's at stake? The establishment of the kinship alliance relationships, and of course, establishing a certain control on the family wealth. Okay, inheritance problems and so on. Fine. Well, this was, therefore, marriage had nothing to do with this, but only a problem of alliance, of course, in connection with the procreation as well. Begetting children, so to speak, okay, to ensure the continuance of the family line, etc.
Do we need to, or should we need to pleasure house? This picture is pleasure house, and not only court law, but sexuality or less, sexual intercourse is understood as something like a craft.
Yeah.
In the context of pleasure house and court.
Yeah. Exactly. Actually, throughout the end of that period, throughout the end of the Middle Age or beginning of modernity, when this noble class began to dissolve and giving way to a new class, okay, what we are going to find out, encounter, is the concept of libertinage, okay, libertinage, okay, in the persona of a mixed persona of a noble bourgeois, the best example of which is Marquis de Sade, you know. So the excessive libertinage, on the bourgeois side you'll find, for instance, a figure like nothing less than an Oscar Wilde, André Gide, and so on. Okay, on the aristocratic side, Marquis de Sade, etc. Okay, so this was, however, the end of the period. Okay, when the system is about to collapse or is already in the process of collapsing. Well, however, normally speaking, sexual intercourse was conceived to be having nothing to do with its marital relationship, however. Okay? Okay, a certain chastity had been expected from the marital couples, but there was no such procedure as to ensure this chastity. Okay? Apart from that famous chastity belts. You know? Böyle hani demirden bağlıyorsun, kadının burasına giydiriyorsun kemer falan, kilitliyorsun, gidiyorsun ondan sonra. The very existence of those belts itself showing that nobody was sure the sexual potentialities of the noble individual at the time. Okay? Great. So, therefore, when it comes to the question of the actual sexual relationships, okay, the situation is rather complicated, we can say at least. In contrast and in response to these two, actually, we see the development of that idealized courtly love, okay, where all love affair, all affectionate relationship have been stripped of any connotation, any relationship with sexuality, the real sexual contact. Okay, so it was therefore purely platonic, the knight feeling itself emotionally devoted to the lady without any expectation from her, which can, a situation, as you can imagine, which can only be found in romances, okay, in idealized perspective. For instance, that famous story about, what was his name, a part of the tale of the round table, you know, that lady of the king, the relationship between the lady of the king and first knight of the round table. I forgot their names. Yeah, Lancelot and Guinevere or somebody like this. It was about something about their love affair, okay? No sexual contact, no real fulfillment, but a complete devotion. Okay. On the part of the male, not on the part of the female. The female had been being devoted to the real husband, as it was depicted in the stories. Okay, so that was the case. About clergy, we can easily say that the ideal was their absolute chastity, of course. But in which, in practice, we have lots of stories showing that there were ongoing promiscuous sexual relationships, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, whatever you like to call them, okay, on the part of the clergy. And when it comes to the serfs, this situation turns out to be even worse. In other words, the sexual life of the medieval society, seen from a modern perspective, appears something like what Foucault did call, in the period of collapse, in the earlier period, as the opening up of a huge field of undefined illegalities, was the picture here. Okay? A huge field of undefined sexualities, so to speak, okay, was the picture here. Now, it is true within the institutions of discipline, primarily schools as well as in other institutions of discipline, through the generic talk on the problem of the suppression of sexualities, Foucault argues that the modern sexualities began to be produced. Okay, so the flourishment of the talk about the requirement of oppression of the sexualities, actually, rather than oppressing them, did produce them. Okay, and make them what you are in terms of your sexualities. Okay, and this process was conceived as a smaller part of the larger process of the taming of the modern individual. Okay, so modern individual hooked into the operations of the modern system of power, whether you call it disciplinary power or biopower or whatever else. Okay, your sexualities is constitute a larger part of this being hooked situation. Okay, so we are hooked into the system of the operations of power in a rather strong sense of the term through our sexualities. Okay, sexuality is being an important part of what we are today. Okay, our sexualities being heterosexual, our being homosexual, etc., etc. All these, the argument, one of the important consequences of the argument is this. Okay, the production of the sexual identities is a modern phenomenon. The ancient Greek did not call themselves heterosexuals, did not call themselves homosexuals, bisexuals, transvestites, or whatever else. Okay, they did not concern themselves with that problem. Their problem was the problem of pleasure, which is something else. Okay. Their problem was quite different from the modern problem of defining and producing the sexualities. Okay? So, an important contribution to the analysis of gender and sexuality and etc. turns out to be this. Okay? Sexualities are historical. Okay? Sexualities are historical, meaning that one finds oneself in a given contemporary society as homosexual, as heterosexual, or whatever else, are socially and historically produced. Okay? And it also whispers that one does not need sexual identification. And actually, in actual life, this would be one of the main strategies for Foucault, okay? To unhook himself from the operations of power, engaging in quite promiscuous sexual activity, for instance, in his own life. Okay? Well, this ends up, let this be the end of our discussion of the contributions onto sexuality. The later two volumes, rather than concentrating on this same problem, however, turns attention to the problem of the subjects. Okay? Now, as you have seen, so far the subject enters into our picture, our analysis, as something produced, as a function of the power relations, or as a function of the exercise of power. And that this very term turns out to be, in the context of the earlier two books, Discipline and Punishment, Volume 1 of History of Sexuality, something mysterious. Okay. Now, from then on, Foucault come to accept that, of course, when he was talking about power, he was talking about the relationship among the individuals, and of course, in such situations, one turns out to be a certain subject exercising power over the other. From this, now power acquires a new definition, okay, which he would connect later on in the couple of the last following 2 years to his one of very popular concepts, governmentality. Okay, now power began to be described as the capacity to act on the actions of the others. Now, this is an important shift, actually, in the interpretation of powers, simply because so far we have not defined power as the capacity of someone. Okay? Power was the result of that confrontational relationship. That was all. Okay, and since it emerged out of the inequality produced in this confrontational relationship, of course, it would produce a certain one as subject or self, and another one as the object, or if you like, the other. Okay, but this relative distribution of the roles does not ensure that the self or the subject was capable of controlling or having the capacity of exercising power, etc. Okay, it was situationally generated. The situation makes, the inequality in the situation makes one subject or the self, and the other object or the other. Okay. However, here, as we can see, now it's defined in terms of a capacity belonging to someone. Okay. So, actually, this capacity would later on be translated into the term government. And later on, since this problem of government acting on the actions of the others would turn out to be interpreted in terms of a question of consciousness, this government would acquire a suffix translating the term into another quite popular term, governmentality. Okay? Now, with this, as you can understand, it turns out to be almost as a matter of necessity that Foucault, it was time for Foucault to deal with the question of the subject. Okay? Simply because within this discussion, the subject had already been produced and poses itself as the central problem. Now, from then on, Foucault began to interpret, including his earlier work, as an effort to understand the processes of subjectivation. In the middle period, when he wrote down 1975-76, when he wrote down these earlier two volumes, he described his primary concern as the understanding of the operations of power. Okay? Now, let me read from that famous afterword that he wrote to Dreyfus and Rabinov's book, Beyond Structuralism and Hermeneutics, or something like that, with the title, published in 1982. Okay? He says here, my objective instead has been to create a history of the different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subjects. My work has dealt with three modes of objectification which transform human beings into subjects. One, the first is the modes of inquiry which try to give themselves the status of sciences. For example, the objectivizing of the speaking subject in Grammaire Générale, in philology and linguistics. When I return back to those books, I do not find any subject, though, I should confess. Okay? While what I do find in those books is rather a discourse operating independent of the subjects. Okay? But now we have a new interpretation of the earlier work under the light of this last concern. Okay, now reinterpreting and representing those works within this new context. Therefore, the question there posed, according to this later perspective, that objectivation of subject within discursive practices. Okay, fine. Or again, in this first mode, the objectivizing of the productive subject, the subject who labors in the analysis of wealth and of economics. Or a third example, the objectivizing of the sheer fact of being alive in natural history or biology. The second part of my work, the part that we have discussed so far, okay, Discipline and Punish, and first volume at least of History of Sexuality, I have studied the objectivizing of the subject in what I call dividing practices. The subject is neither divided inside himself or divided from others. This process objectivizes him. Examples are the mad, the sane, the sick and the healthy, and criminals and the good boys. Sorry, this second phase refers to those other works concerned with the transformation of medical gaze, the differentiation of rationality from madness, etc. Okay? And finally, I have sought to study, it's my current work, the way a human being turns himself into a subject. Okay? Now, this formulation is quite interesting. So far, we have discussed that the subjectivation of the individual, if it is even right to put the problem in this way, okay? The subjectivation of the individual was conceived in relation to the operations of power. Now, here, a completely new perspective. Let me read. The way a human being turns himself into a subject. What kind of difference there is between these two? Now, as you can see here, the starting point is not the power relations which can be conceived if we pursue that separation between internal and external, which could be conceived as an internal impact or external impact or effect on the individual. Okay? So these power relations surrounding the individual always posed in terms of its being exercised on the individual. Actually, we were not talking about the individual. We were talking about body. We were talking about body and soul and functionality of the body. We were not talking about individual previously. Now here, individual comes to the center place, and now within this reasserted division between the internal and external, now Foucault poses the problem as to study the process of no longer objectivation of subjectivity, but subjectivation of the individual as a, this is crucial, as an internal process pertaining to the individual. Okay. As something which takes place inside the individual, as a result of the specific efforts requiring a certain intentionality and exercise of the will belonging to the individual. Okay? So far, these new concepts, which we would have difficulties in incorporating to the earlier Foucault corpus, okay, had been reintroduced into the picture. Okay. Okay.
It isn't our text. That's not our text, right? It isn't.
Yeah, this is one of the texts I've given assigned to you. It's titled "The Subject and Power." One of the, yeah, this is the same text. So this version had been published in, where was it? Critical Inquiry, Volume 8, Number 4, Summer 1982. But I guess earlier in that year, or 1 year earlier, it has been written as to be added as the afterword, to that actually very influential, interesting book. I recommend you, all of you, to read. Dreyfus and Rabinow were their last names, right? Beyond Structuralism and Hermeneutics, Michel Foucault, or something like that, the title of the book. And if I can find it here. No, it has not been mentioned here. The original publication was there, so this has been a republication in the Critical Inquiry, was that? Yeah, Critical Inquiry, summer 1982. Okay, now, this shift, even though difficult to understand from a theoretical perspective, it appears, I am not sure, it appears out of, as a necessity to be able to respond to the critiques which themselves having a ground in actuality, telling that Foucault's earlier conceptualization of power is omnipresent and omnipotent. Okay? As you can see in these analyses, there is no way for the individual to await from the operations of power. Actually, the individual, owing its very existence as individual or as subject, or if you like, forget about this theory-laden concepts. As somebody, to exist as somebody in society, needs to be processed through the operations of power, if you like. Okay? This gives, of course, no way to that famous, if you ask me, bourgeois question of the freedom of the individual. Okay? No possibility of the freedom of the individual, as you can see here. Okay? So, to be able to create a gap within this tightly interwoven relations of power, producing individual, however and whatever it is, in a process of necessity, actually, should be a little bit loosened up. And the strategy, it appears, adopted by Foucault to be able to loosen up is to reintroduce the concept of the subject, which has been tried to be denied or defied and disintegrated so far. Okay? Now, the subject is here, and the subject is understood as capable of having an internality of its own, independent of the operations of the external forces, therefore capable of posing the problem to itself, the problem of cultivation of the self. Okay? And to be able to ground this argument, Foucault takes recourse to the arguments developed again in ancient Greek philosophy, suggesting that what has been posed as one of the major problems in ancient Greek philosophy in that famous formulation at the Delphi oracle, know thyself. Okay? You know, this is one of the sayings of Yunus Emre as well, as far as I know. Or ne literatürü diyoruz? Tasavvuf literatürü diyoruz, değil mi? One of the important sayings of tasavvuf literature as well. Know thyself. And prefers to read it. He says that this dictum overshadows or sheds its shadow on actually a more important requirement, okay? A more important requirement, which is necessitated even for one to be able to say, know thyself. Okay, it is the care of the self. He would start his argument by saying that in ancient Greece, these two problems, problem of knowledge on the one hand, and the problem of the care of the self, had been handled, intermingled together, okay? One expressing itself in philosophical discourse, the other one expressing itself in spiritual discourse, okay? Spiritual discourse meaning here all these procedures, trainings, interventions as to constitute a self capable of knowing. Okay? So the requirement is knowing one's own self, but to be able to do so, knowledge, as he argues, I'm not convinced by this argument by the way, but as he argues, knowledge in those times was conceived as something which requires a certain constitution of the self. Okay? So that this means that not everybody is capable of knowing. Okay? So to be able to capable of knowing, one has to work on the self. Okay? One has to work on the self as to form a specific self which would turn out to be capable of knowing. This what he calls spirituality, as he connects the problem of knowing with philosophy. And he argues that up until the modern times, including the medieval Christianity, the period of medieval Christianity, these two went somehow hand in hand. Even though he points out a certain moment in history, he calls it the Cartesian moment, as the moment of separation of these two. He would argue that from then on, if you like, under modernity, okay, the problem of knowledge posed as independently from the problem of the spiritual constitution of the self. Okay? Now, it is out of this forgetfulness and separation of the question of knowledge from the question of the cultivation of the self, if you like. Now, the modern man and modern forms of knowledge began to be generated, forgetting the requirement of, so to speak, the forming of a particular self. Therefore, he would delve into the question of this cultivation of the self in connection with the problem of this time, the internal constitution of a certain subjectivity according to a certain design. Okay? Actually, this may find its co-relevant partner in earlier discussions, while, for instance, we return back to the formation of that self-discipline within this narrow environment of the Christian monastery. Okay? It was exactly on these grounds you'll find out that what he would later call as disciplinary power, okay, through the ascetic efforts of these members of the Christian monks, monasteries, okay, they intervened into the formation of their selves as to constitute themselves in the form of religious personality or whatever, I do not know. Okay? So what's at stake here? Then, with regard to the question of subjectivity, then turns out to be the conscious intervention of the individual out of its own internality. Therefore, since the separation now reintroduced into the picture between the internal and external, therefore it turns out to be unavoidable to talk about the operation of power as external forces, and therefore Foucault poses the problem of power this time always and always in connection with the problem of resistance. However, previously in the exposition of the Discipline and Punish, there is very tiny little space devoted to the question of resistance. From then on, the question of resistance would occupy a center place in the arguments and discussions in relation to the possibility of politics and political struggle around contemporary world. Exactly at the place where class struggles has been lost its possibility on the one hand, where really, so to speak, really quote unquote, meaningful political struggle turned out to be, have been proved out to be almost an impossibility. Okay, that's why we began to talk about during these years so-called quote-unquote new social movements. Okay, new social movements no longer being capable of yielding considerable change, considerable results, but rather aiming at tiny little, acquiring tiny little, producing consequences. Okay, for instance, so far, the most successful result generated by these movements being that famous protest on the streets of the Wall Street, okay, against the financial capital operations of the financial capital, which did not actually yield any meaningful and actual result, okay. So it is now a new period in terms of the meaning of the political. Now it's alternative answers are tried to be generated to that really burning problem, okay? Now, the problem is actually, let me put it in this way, not only formulated in Foucault, or not only tried to be responded by Foucault, but as well other thinkers, is that meaningful political action within this framework turns out to be an impossibility, okay? We will see this conclusion in the ideas developed by other thinkers, other postmodern thinkers as well. Okay? The major problem being that with the demise of Marxism and with the demise of class struggle, the argument has lost so-called its historical subject. That agency which turned out to be capable of engaging in political struggle, so to speak. Okay? Now we are looking for it, and it appears that Foucault's response for this is the possibility, but it's a strange possibility simply because it is constructed and proposed somewhere away from the field of politics. In the internal existence of the individual now delves with the question, especially in connection with the question of knowing thy own self, delves into the labor of cultivating its own self, producing its own self as this particular self, appropriate for this task of knowing. Okay? Now, the first procedure he proposes is the aesthetical constitution of the self. Okay? Aesthetical constitution of the self revolves around the issue of posing a self, producing a self as an aesthetic object. A life, production of a certain self as the artwork itself. Okay? Now, later on, he changes his position and replaces this aesthetical concern. You do not look at me in that way, okay? When knowledge fails, for instance, another important thinker, for instance, Martin Heidegger, would propose poetry as the possibility of telling the truth, okay? When knowledge fails, Heidegger returns back to poetry as the capacity, still contained capacity of telling the truth. Now Foucault, taken as one of his major problems in that period, parrhesia, saying the truth about oneself, okay, concentrates this time again, when aesthetical aspect fails, to what he calls ethical, or I don't know what it has been translated ethical, but rather actually from this ethical one should understand morality. Okay? Organization of behavior and constitution of the self around that behavior as a moral problem. Okay? Now we have made almost a complete detour, and we are even somewhere, at least chronologically, much earlier than the point we have started. Okay? Let this be the end of the Foucault lecture.